Hello and welcome to another round of Democracy and Dictatorship. A worrying number of people are being radicalized and are attracted to the path of violent extremism. Countless people across the globe have fallen victim to acts of terror, carried out in the name of religion, political ideologies, economic inequalities, and much more. There is a gap between the way we talk about radicalization and what actually takes place. Radicalization is essentially the process by which individuals or groups are pushed into adopting extremist views, the means to an end, if you'd like. We recently had the opportunity to meet a former extremist from Sweden. Kimi Allen spoke to our correspondent Priyanka Verma about his childhood, his journey to extremism, and what got him out of it.
How was it growing up, and how was where did you go for education, and how did it all start?
Yeah, I grew up in this small village, small outside a bigger town. It just lived like 3,000 people or something like that. And it was that kind of village where the boys are supposed to fix the cars and the girls are supposed to be wives and cook at home and take care of the children. And I didn't even like cars. I like to read, I like to write. Besides that, my father was racist himself, and when I started in school, I started getting bullied. Felt like I was no one, and I have no friends at all. And the year I was 12 years old, I found this CD, a Swedish band that called themselves Ultima Thule. It was anthems like Sweden, Sweden, Fatherland, and Vikings, and about to be proud of Sweden, to be proud for who I was, a Swede. So I start getting an identity with this CD, with this band. Sometimes later I met a guy who also listened to this music, and we start hanging out and listen to music together, and he was, wear this bomber jacket and boots and shaved head. He was really cool and kind of popular in school. So I shaved my hair, put on the boots and the bomber jacket, and become like him.
From 2001 to 2009, you were part of this group, National Socialist Party.
Yeah.
How was it like? Yeah, how was it like?
It was kind of violent, it's a violent environment, and drink a lot, get addicted fast, and start drinking already when we were 12 years old. And when we were 14 years old, we were addicted already, and start fighting the communists and immigrants. And yet those 8 years, I didn't even speak to an immigrant.
How did you get out from that, whole group?
It was, I took the hard way. It was in 2009, one of my friends, he died. He took his own life, hanged himself. And I couldn't control myself and couldn't handle that he died, and start taking drugs and become an amphetamine addict. And went to jail and rehabs and de-radicalization. That took time, because even if I left the organization, I didn't left it inside here or here. First time I met an immigrant, it was on a boxing club. I have started training boxing in 2010, 2011 or something. And a guy named Ahmed was start talking to me, and I asked, hey, why are you talking to me? I don't want to talk to you. And he kept talking to me and talked, and somehow we become friends. And somehow there my racism just disappeared.
It's sad that it took a personal tragedy to change Kimi's heart. But still, he's one of the lucky ones. Kimi Allen now lives in Sweden and works as a youth educator, helping young people stay the course. But so many others still are in the grasp of extremist ideologies. So what really drives them to it? UNESCO recently held a conference in New Delhi on how education has a role to play in preventing violent extremism. WION spoke with some of the delegates present at the meet. Here's what we found causes people to radicalize.
The misconceptions about certain religious beliefs where people are targeted. And these people are targeted in the system are generally people who find the education system not matching up to the expectations.
It's historical injustice, and it's in countries that were colonized. They are advancing the ideology of freedom through violence. So they are trying to decolonize through violence.
Boko Haram se propose de prendre en charge votre famille, et donc face à un jeune qui est désespéré, qui n'a pas de perspective, cela est très attractif pour lui.
What we do know is that a lot of it comes out of a search for identity, dignity, security, belonging to a higher ideal, and also disenfranchisement with public support.
The people who are living are very, what you call extreme poverty. Extreme poverty. They have nothing to lose.
Whether it's being the minority or being not being able to raise your voice, or feeling that your community is being discriminated against. So I think if we tackle these issues, if we go to the core, which is social justice, and making sure that everyone is respected, regardless of where you come from and your ethnicity or your beliefs, in all societies. If we find a way to do this, I think we will have no extremism.
Will extremism really end if we figure out a way to iron out societal inequalities? Is education the only way to solve this crisis? Or is it merely a temporary solution? How can we work towards a safer world for ourselves and our children? Let's take a short break now. When we return, we're going to talk more about causes, problems, and the possible way out of extremism. Our guests for this episode will be sharing their encounters with extremism and their expertise in tackling it. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We're thrilled to have with us in studio Irshad Manji, who's a Canadian author, educator, and advocate of a reformist interpretation of Islam. Also with us is Rafiullah Kakar, a researcher with the Commonwealth Secretariat. Rafiullah grew up in a conflict-ridden region in Pakistan. He went on to win the Rhodes Scholarship and studied at Oxford University. We also have with us Dr. Anand Duryapa, Director of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. Thank you all for being here today. Let me start by asking, Rafiullah, you grew up in Balochistan in Pakistan. How was it growing up in a place that was so conflict-ridden?
When I was growing up there, it was a time when sort of this religious conflict was going on, and children of my age sort of idealized going to Afghanistan, fighting the so-called Holy War. So for me, when I came out of that region for higher education and sort of getting out of that mindset and dealing with it when people in other parts of the world, in other parts of the country see it the same thing from a completely different angle. So I had sort of internalized that very idea of freedom fighters, holy war, and stuff like that.
Irshad, let me bring you in here. A lot of extremists seem to quote the Quran. For you to be a Muslim and then hear their interpretation of Islam, how does that make you feel?
Well, I feel heartbroken. I feel like there is so much raw material within the Quran that can be cited for compassion and empathy. One of my favorite verses, I must tell you, is chapter 13, verse 11, which says, God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is inside themselves. And that means taking on our ego, our pride, and coming to terms with the fact that we must coexist. And so I have made it my life's mission to ensure, to the degree I and my supporters can, that younger Muslims all around the world understand that it is not the book itself that speaks in God's name, because we as human beings interpret it. it is we, Muslims, through our actions and our inaction, who speak in God's name. And so if we want Islam to be known and really understood as a religion of peace, guess what? We're the ones who have to act that way.
You actually look at the history, and if you look at the recent history, a lot of the big names in terrorism, if I may say so. Look at Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who has a degree. Jihadi John was from the University of Westminster. Hafiz Saeed has 2 master's degrees and taught engineering at Lahore. Abu Bakr as well has higher education in Islam. How do we then turn around and kind of talk about education that will help bring down violence? Would you like to answer that, Anand?
If you look at what we produce now, we produce very good, what I would call cogs within a great production system. These people are excellent in being part of an economic system, producing. If, say, some message comes across, the ability to deconstruct it to its basic elements and then reconstruct it to sort of see, does this make sense? Is it consistent? And as Ishad has mentioned, when you look at when you go then back into the Quran, you sort of question and say, hang on, there's a problem here. So, but we don't do that. But that's not enough.
Is there even a problem?
Oh, absolutely. And Dr. Duriyappa has actually put his finger on the pulse of something very important that, in my view, most educators don't even have the language yet to express, which is, it's not enough to teach students to think critically. Many students will think critically, tear down, the status quo, but don't know how to reassemble the pieces that they've then torn down into something sustainable and alternative. And so, in addition to critical thinking, I think the 21st century requires us to teach generative thinking, create new ideas, potentially more sustainable solutions.
Fiola, you were radicalized when you were a youngster. Can you explain what that even means?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I mean, given the challenges surrounding the definition of radicalization, it's difficult for me to say, but what I would like to say is that yes, I was a supporter of many terrorist groups and I had sympathies with them, and I used to wait for Taliban's propaganda videos, like young people wait for their favorite Bollywood movies, for the release or launch of their favorite Bollywood movies. And for me, interestingly, it was not mosque that radicalized me, if we sort of agree on the term. It was education, it was the school system. And in the school system, in my view, 2 things that played a key role was, number 1 was the way religion is taught. Number 2, the way history is taught. And in the South Asian, or at least in the Pakistani education system, till grade 12, the only sort of social sciences that you're taught are the religious studies and the Pakistan studies, or the history subject. And my understanding is that, at least in my country, the way religion was taught or is taught is a very literal, based on a very literal interpretation of the scriptures and Sunnah. And then history, the way history is taught, I understand most countries have their own foundational myths, which is understandable. But the problem is, if you otherize certain countries or certain ethnic or religious groups to an extent that graduates or high school students begin to hate those countries or those others, then this is sort of a lethal combo where a political other sort of combines with the way with your religious identity. That is where it creates an atmosphere where young people like me support violence, though they may not themselves perpetrate that violence.
We're going to take a short break now. More when we return. Welcome back to the show. We've been talking with Irshad Manji, Rafiullah Kakar and Anand Duryapa about education and extremism. Stalin, the British, changing the curriculum to a point where you then begin changing societies. There has been a lot of debate in India as well about, changing of the books over the years. One political party comes in place and there's a certain kind of education, and then it changes over a period of time. And it actually begins changing the narrative. And that narrative then kind of adds to the whole psyche that you want to create over a period of time. We were talked about radicalism. I was in Swat and I went to a de-radicalization center in Swat where they had taken a bunch of terrorists and they divided them into two different groups. One was the black, which they said could never change. And then the other group was gray. And they were trying to teach them things like plumbing, electrical work, to bring about change. Do you think that de-radicalization may then be important to bring them back? Rafiullah, back at you.
Well, of course, de-radicalization is very important, but I'm skeptical of most of the sort of de-radicalization strategies or approaches adopted by countries and international agencies. I think we first have to understand the process, and the reality is there is no single explanation. It is very contextual. The problem with most of these de-radicalization strategies is that they do not want to talk about religion. Those people who are radicalized, they have a very strong faith-based motivation. You have to change their understanding of that faith. And that, in my view, is the key.
Irshad, you grew up as a Muslim. You're still a Muslim.
Indeed.
What made you do what you're doing?
Precisely because I'm Muslim and I love Allah. Now, notice I didn't say I love religion or organized religion. I love God. And God is in everything. Those who don't share my faith are also God's creation. And so what has made me do what I do, namely teach a much more pluralistic version of Islam than the kind of version that Rafi got when he was growing up, but then also to take that starting point and to teach non-Muslims this kind of leadership called moral courage. Moral courage simply means doing the right thing in the face of your fears. And often what human beings fear the most is not even violence. It is the judgment of others, being judged by others. You like to say nothing is absolute. And that reminds me once again, I am not God, and neither are you. And so let's all be human together, make our mistakes, forgive one another, and live the adventure that is life.
Anand, if I were to ask you, how can international organizations get involved in countries which seem to be breeding more terrorists, if I can say that?
In terms of looking at a strategy, a combination of where UNICEF, UNESCO, UNDP put in their resources, the whole notion of how we would design education strategy that is different from what we have. I think one of the things that I would always want to stress is not to go in and say, this is what the good thing is. We've been doing that for a long time. We have to allow the young people to find out within themselves, like what Isha is talking about, a self-journey on what that good thing is.
One of the things that would be wonderful for the life skills of a new generation is to learn how to become mentors to one another. And that way, when you have that self-doubt, is what I'm doing the right thing, you can actually confide to your mentor without fear of judgment. More of us had mentoring, we would not need so much medicating.
If I may turn around, and I want to ask this question to each one of you separately. If we believe for today extremism is here to stay for a bit, then, and it's not the only factor, and education is not the only factor that's going to help us out of extremism. Ananta, How do we come out of it? What are the other factors?
There's no quick fix. It's going to be a long process. And two is, we've been talking about extremism the religious extremism, but there are other forms of extremism that we also need to also address, and that's been on the rising trend. White supremacy has been there, but now it's rising again. The far right is now seeing a surge in Europe. So I think what I'm calling is for a radical change in the way that we see what our future is going to look like. And starting off with the economic systems, and then looking at the social and many of the things that we talked about in terms of how we change that education system.
Dr. Ananda has said most of the things. There isn't enough left for me, but I would just insist on one approach, and that is we have to create an environment where an organic growth of pluralistic ideas can take place. One caution that we need to keep in mind, particularly when we are operating in the sort of international development sector, is when we go to countries, we prescribe to them what to do or what not to do. That's not going to help. And also a top-down approach to secularism or whatever is not going to help. History of Middle East and other countries reveals it clearly. The organic growth is going to take a while. There are no quick fixes. We first have to understand, and we have to sort of get rid of this M&E and donor-based sort of approach where you have to deliver results within 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. I don't think that's going to happen.
Rashad, do you agree that extremism is here to stay for a while?
To the degree that extremism has taken, a generation and more to emerge, it will also take a generation or more to at least be curbed. Look, again, we're human. Human nature lends itself to a certain degree of laziness. So there will always be people in every society that would rather, be loud and destructive than calm and constructive. This is where I think the other force that we have not yet talked about and is a source of great education and miseducation comes in, and that's media.
Yeah.
Thrilled to be on a program called Democracy and Dictatorship. Now, how do we get kids, and their parents for that matter, watching and discussing? And I would say, instead of fantasizing about people going offline, I say, goes back to teaching. Let's teach them to use social media, to use broadcast media to start new conversations, ones that they wouldn't have had, any other opportunity to get into.
One of the takeaways, I've spent over the last 2 decades in multiple war zones of the world, it's almost impossible to impart education, forget quality or a holistic education, if basic peace is missing. And so violence lends itself to extremism over a period of time, and miseducation of what you talked about. So I think we first will have to bring about some form of peace to then be able to go out and even impart what we are hoping our next generations would be.
The peace, let's understand, as Martin Luther King pointed out, isn't just the absence of conflict. It is the presence of justice. And while, again, there are no quick fixes, nonetheless, to be equipping the next generation to look at nagging problems in a way that does show compassion for the so-called other side.
Absolutely.
Is very doable.
With you, absolutely.
Okay?
With
the
you
question
on that.
is, do we as adults have the stamina and, frankly, the caring needed to turn that over to them in an informed way?
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. Violence and extremism destroys societies. It takes decades, if not centuries, to bring them back to normalcy. The trick is to create an environment that is conducive to a healthy debate. Value education may be one of the factors that helps us go towards peace, but it is not the only factor, because nothing is absolute.